In Lagos, the elders still say it plainly. It is the heart we look at, not the garment. Behind every gate of glass and steel, a market of bare feet and bent backs kept the city fed. Before sunrise at her akara stall, Adunni wrapped an extra portion in newspaper and pressed it into a hungry child's hand, refusing the coin he tried to offer back. At home, Adunni pressed a damp cloth to her mother's burning forehead, counting the coins left in her tin and finding again not nearly enough for the malaria drugs the doctor had prescribed. Across the city, in a glass tower built on shipping and oil, Chief Bankole gripped the boardroom table as his chest seized, papers sliding from his hands onto the marble floor. By his bedside, Folarin pressed a folder of transfer documents into his uncle's weak hand, insisting the company needed a steady leader now, not a son who had vanished from every boardroom. Olumide stood at his window above the city, turning over the memory of Beatrice walking out the day she believed, wrongly, that he had lost everything and loved nothing about him that remained. He remembered her exact words. She had not signed up to marry a man with nothing, and she was gone before he could explain the rumor was false, planted by a rival to test him. Olumide told Tunji, his only true friend left in that tower, that he intended one last test, to vanish as a penniless stranger and see if any woman would love him with nothing. Tunji warned him plainly that Folarin was already circling Chief Bankole's bedside and that disappearing now, even for love, could hand the cousin everything he had been hungry for since boyhood. Olumide answered that some things mattered more than a company, and that night, Tunji staged his car to crash and burn at a slum's edge so the city and his own family would believe him dead. Olumide, now answering only to the name Dapo, lay in the dirt near the market stalls, his borrowed clothes torn, his face bruised, waiting for the kind of stranger Tunji had promised would come. Adunni found him there on her way home, knelt without hesitation, and lifted his head onto her lap, calling for water and a name he did not yet trust himself to give her. She told him only that no one healed lying in the dust and helped him toward her compound, unaware that the stranger leaning on her shoulder owned more than every building on that street. In the days that followed, Adunni and her mother nursed the stranger's wounds with herbs and prayer, Mama Adunni declaring, between coughs, that his quiet manners marked him as a man raised well. Word spread fast through the narrow street that an unmarried man now slept under Adunni's compound, and the neighbor women gathered at their doorways to decide loudly what kind of woman allowed that. Landlord Bashiru arrived within a week, jabbing a thick finger toward her door, warning that he ran a respectable compound and would not have a strange man living there unmarried much longer. Mama Adunni, weaker each day, took her daughter's hand and said plainly that the stranger had a gentle spirit and that marriage would silence the gossip and keep a good man near. Adunni paced the courtyard long after her mother slept, unconvinced that pity was reason enough to marry a man whose surname she did not even know, let alone his heart. Behind the compound at night, Tunji slipped him supplies and a warning of his own. Guilt was a luxury, Tunji said, that the real test of Adunni's heart could not afford yet. Dapo offered to mend her wobbling stall table, his soft, uncalloused hands fumbling the hammer twice before he managed it, and Adunni laughed for the first time since the accident. She noticed more than once that his words carried a polish no jobless man should have, and when she asked, he only said an old teacher had been strict and changed the subject. Miles away, men paid by Folarin combed the wreck Olumide had staged, troubled that nobody had ever been recovered from a crash that should, by every account, have killed a man. Tunji returned in plain clothes, leaving a box marked as a church donation at her gate, careful that the money inside, however small it looked to her, never traced back to him. At the market, the women teased her openly, asking what good a jobless, homeless man could bring a household already struggling, and Adunni answered only that kindness was not a transaction. Her friend Bisi pulled her aside and warned gently but firmly that pity had a way of dressing itself up as love and then leaving a woman to pay for it alone. That night, Adunni sat by candlelight staring at a hospital bill she could not pay, her mother's breathing growing shallower in the next room, no answer coming no matter how long she stared. Through the thin wall, Dapo heard every word of it and lay awake long after, turning over how a man with no visible income might quietly make a debt like that disappear. The landlord's patience ran out within days, and a written notice appeared nailed to her door. Marry the stranger properly before the month's end, or both of them would be put out. Adunni read the notice twice, looked back at the quiet man who had mended her table and fed her hope when no one else had, and decided duty would have to stand in for love. She told him plainly, without softness, that she was prepared to marry him to settle the landlord and the gossip, nothing more, and Dapo agreed, hiding how much that nothing meant to him. The introduction was modest and hurried, collar not broken between two families where only one was truly present, while neighbors who had mocked her all month came anyway, hungry for the spectacle. On the wedding day, Mama Adunni rose from her sick bed long enough to press both their hands together, her blessing trembling but certain, the only person there who seemed to believe in it. Adunni spoke her vow without flourish, marrying out of duty and pity a man she believed owned nothing, never once suspecting the fortune standing in one's sandals directly in front of her. Olumide spoke his vow and meant every word, more than he had planned to, and for the first time since the accident, the lie felt heavier than the test it was meant to serve. Their first night as husband and wife passed in careful politeness, two mats laid on opposite sides of one small room, both of them awake long after pretending to be asleep. In the weeks that followed, Dapo learned to carry her akara trays without dropping them, learned the names of her regular customers, and earned slowly the kind of trust that has no contract. When a customer called her foolish for marrying a beggar, Dapo stepped between them, quiet but immovable, and Adunni felt something shift in her chest that pity alone had never caused before. Mama Adunni watched them from her mat most evenings, saying nothing of what she noticed growing between two people who insisted too often that theirs was only an arrangement. One night, Adunni awoke to find his mat empty and through the window saw him outside under the one walking street light, speaking low into a phone, someone on the other end calling him Sir. The next morning, Adunni asked who had called him so late, and Dapo answered only that it was an old friend from before everything fell apart, a half-truth she chose for now to accept. Tunji returned a few nights later, more nervous than before, glancing twice over his shoulder before he spoke, certain, though he could not yet prove it, that someone had begun to ask questions. A private investigator hired by Folarin's money moved through the slum showing an old photograph of Olumide Bankole, asking quietly whether anyone recalled a stranger matching that face after the crash. A mechanic who had once repaired Olumide's car years earlier squinted at the photograph, hesitated, then admitted for a small reward that a man with that same work now lived nearby. Folarin received the tip in his office with a slow, cold smile, certain at last that his cousin had not died in any crash, only hidden himself somewhere far beneath his notice. He sent his own men, quieter than the investigator, to trail the route Tunji's car took twice a week, certain it would lead them somewhere worth far more than its modest appearance. Folarin himself came in plain clothes one afternoon, parking far from the market, and watched from a distance as a man in worn sandals carried akara trays with a bearing he knew too well. Recognition settled over his face slowly, then completely, and Folarin understood that the cousin everyone believed was dead was alive, married, and hiding in plain sight among people who had no idea who he was. He decided, standing there, that exposing Olumide now would cost him everything he had worked toward, and that silence, for the moment, served his ambition far better than the truth ever could. Back at the hospital, Folarin told his uncle that exhaustive searches had confirmed the worst, that Olumide was almost certainly dead, and that the company needed a successor named before the board grew restless. Chief Bankole, grieving and weaker than he let anyone see, agreed at last to let the board consider Folarin's name, though something in him still refused to fully believe his son was gone. Folarin arrived at the market days later, posing as a compliance officer inspecting stall licenses, his questions for Adunni polite on the surface and pointed enough underneath to confirm everything he suspected. He studied the man beside her stall a moment longer than any inspection required, watching his hands, his posture, the way he stood, and left satisfied that his cousin had nowhere left to hide. After the officer left, Adunni mentioned, almost in passing, how closely the man had stared at Dapo and watched her husband's face go still in a way she could not name. That night, Dapo told Tunji they had been found, and Tunji urged him to retreat somewhere safer immediately, but Olumide refused, certain now that leaving Adunni would cost more than staying ever could. Quietly, through a lawyer who never used his name, Folarin bought up the outstanding debt on Mama Adunni's hospital bill, gaining leverage over a family that had no idea it was even for sale. A clerk at the clinic informed Adunni that a new buyer now controlled her mother's bill and could call it due at any time, leaving her with questions no one there would answer. Days later, a messenger arrived at her stall with an envelope of cash and a folded note offering her far more money than she had ever seen, asking only that she leave her husband quietly. Adunni stared at the money long enough to feel its weight, then handed the envelope back untouched, telling the messenger she had married for better reasons than anyone seemed willing to believe. Bisi, hearing what happened, begged her to reconsider for her mother's sake at least, but Adunni only shook her head, saying a vow broken for money was no different from one never made. Within the week, landlord Bashiru appeared again, this time with a new complaint and an eviction order neither Adunni nor Dapo could trace back to the bribe that truly caused it. They moved their few belongings into a smaller, damper room at the edge of the slum, Adunni carrying her mother's mat herself, while Dapo apologized for a misfortune he could not yet explain. Word moved through the market that Adunni's useless husband had brought nothing but bad luck since the day he arrived, and her regular customers began quietly buying their akara somewhere else. In the new, damper room, Mama Adunni's cough worsened sharply, her fever climbing through the night, while Adunni pressed wet cloths to her skin with hands that had nothing else to give. Alone with her thoughts, Adunni found herself turning the messenger's offer over again, hating that survival had a price tag and that pride, however justified, would not pay her mother's bills. Watching her unravel quietly beside her mother's mat, Dapo slipped the leather wristband from his arm and weighed for the first time since the accident, parting with the one thing he had left. At a pawn shop 2 streets away, Dapo handed over the small gold crest charm hidden inside his wristband, the last physical proof of who Olumide Bankole used to be, in exchange for cash. The pawnbroker turned the charm over twice, recognizing craftsmanship far too fine for the man standing in front of him, but said nothing and counted out the money without asking questions. When the money appeared unexplained, Adunni asked where it came from, and Dapo told her he had found a day's labor unloading trucks, another small lie sitting heavier on him than the last. Tunji arrived with worse news that his own contacts confirmed that Folarin had not only found Olumide, but had already tried and failed to pay Adunni to disappear from his life entirely. Olumide sat with it, furious that his test had pulled Adunni into danger she never agreed to, torn between revealing everything now and protecting her with silence a little longer. Tunji argued that with Chief Bankole still alive and the board not yet voted, coming forward now could save both the company and Adunni, while waiting any longer might cost them both. Still, Olumide hesitated, more afraid of the moment Adunni learned she was a test than anything Folarin's money or men could threaten against him directly. Impatient that bribery had failed twice, Folarin gave a different order this time, sending 2 enforcers to persuade the stranger calling himself Dapo to leave Lagos quietly, by force if necessary. The 2 men cornered Dapo in a dark alley near the slum that night, gripping his collar and warning him to vanish before morning if he valued whatever life he had left. Tunji arrived just as the first blow landed, throwing himself into the struggle, taking a strike meant for Olumide across the shoulder before the enforcer scattered into the dark at the sound of approaching voices. Adunni ran out at the noise and found Tunji bleeding against the wall and Dapo shaking, his calm composure finally cracking in front of her for the very first time. Trembling, she demanded to know who would send men to hurt a jobless stranger, and for the first time allowed herself to fully believe that Dapo was carrying a secret far larger than fatigue or shame. Across town, at a party thick with gossip, Beatrice overheard a whisper that a man who looked exactly like the late Olumide Bankole had been seen alive in a forgotten Lagos slum. Adunni pressed him again for the truth, and Dapo told her carefully that dangerous men from his past had finally caught up with him, though he stopped well short of explaining why. She wanted more than that, but exhaustion and worry over Tunji's wound and her mother's fever left no strength that night to push the question any further. Tunji refused a doctor's visit, certain any hospital record could be traced, and let Adunni clean and bind his wound herself by lamplight instead, grateful and stubborn in equal measure. As she walked, Tunji found himself telling her in careful pieces that her husband was a far better man than this slum or its gossip would ever let her see. Privately, Tunji and Olumide agreed that Folarin would try again, and Tunji insisted on staying close permanently now, abandoning every pretense of subtlety that had protected them before. Landlord Bashiru, frightened by the violence so near his property, threatened to call the area police himself, adding another pressure to a household already buckling under too many. Adunni begged him to leave for her family's safety, certain his presence had brought the danger, but Dapo refused flatly, telling her he would not run from anything again as long as she stayed. She said nothing more, but something in her chest loosened quietly at a man choosing to stay through danger rather than carry it elsewhere and disappear. In a rare, calm evening, Dapo tried his hand at seasoning a pot of stew under her strict instruction, ruining it twice before Adunni finally laughed and took the spoon from him herself. On a quiet Sunday, they queued together for the free community clinic for her mother's checkup, his hand finding hers in the line without either of them remarking on it. Mama Adunni, between coughs, told Dapo's stories of Adunni's late father, welcoming him fully into a family he had only meant at first to study from the outside. By lamplight, Adunni mended the one good shirt he owned, his eyes following her steady hands while neither of them spoke, both aware that something real had quietly taken root. She admitted to Bisi, almost shyly, that pity had somehow turned into something she no longer had a simple word for, and that she no longer minded the change. Bisi teased her gently for it, relieved more than anything to see her friend's face finally soften after months of worry, death, and gossip wearing her down. Alone that night, Olumide opened a small notebook and began a letter to her he was not certain he would ever have the courage to give, confessing more than he had told anyone since the accident. He hid the notebook beneath a loose floorboard beside his mat, the closest thing to a confession he had managed to make since the night the lie began. Across town, Beatrice hired her own investigator, separate from anything tied to Folarin, determined to confirm the rumor of Olumide's survival before anyone else could move on it. She visited old mutual friends over coffee, fishing gently for any detail about Olumide under the practiced disguise of concern she no longer entirely felt. Beatrice's investigator canvassed the same slum weeks after Folarin's men had already passed through, stirring fresh suspicion among neighbors already wary of strangers asking about Dapo. Adunni noticed a different stranger asking the same questions Folarin's men once had, and told Dapo with rising alarm that more than one danger now seemed to be circling them. Privately, Beatrice reasoned that if Olumide truly lived and his company sat in chaos, returning to his side now could restore everything she had lost the day she walked away from him. Unwilling to wait on her investigator any longer, Beatrice dressed plainly, left her usual jewelry behind, and decided to search the slum herself, sunglasses pushed up to hide her impatience. She arrived at the edge of the market in an inconspicuous car, scanning the crowd slowly from behind dark glasses, searching for a face she had once known far too well. For one instant, she caught a profile across the crowd that stopped her breath entirely, though the angle and the worn clothes left her unsure enough to look again before acting. Folarin, meanwhile, walked the board privately, promising favorable terms to individual members in exchange for their support in the vote he had already scheduled in his mind. Visiting in secret, Tunji learned from the chief's doctors that the old man had weeks left at most, a timeline that suddenly made every remaining hour feel impossibly short. He carried that prognosis straight back to Olumide, the two of them sitting in silence afterward, aware that whatever decision remained now had to be made in days, not seasons. Stunned and awed, Folarin secured enough signed support among the board to feel certain of victory, allowing himself for the first time in weeks a small private smile of satisfaction. He announced the board vote date publicly soon after, presenting himself to reporters as the company's steady, dependable future, while Chief Bankole lay unconsulted in his hospital bed. Tunji brought Olumide a leaked memo naming the exact date of the vote, and Olumide understood, reading it twice, that his window to act was closing faster than he had planned for. He told Tunji he had decided he would reveal himself before the vote, but he wanted one last night first, just Dapo, beside the woman who had no idea what was coming. Tunji nodded and began quietly preparing the documents and security Olumide's return would require, the careful work of a man who had waited years for this exact moment. While cleaning their room the next morning, Adunni's hand brushed a loose floorboard beside Dapo's mat, and she noticed, almost absently, that it shifted more than it should. She lifted it slowly and found a small notebook hidden beneath, hesitating with her hand over the cover, unsure if some part of a husband's privacy still deserved protecting. She read only a few lines, addressed plainly to her, thick with an affection and a guilt she could not yet place, leaving her more confused than angry. Dapo returned and found her holding it, panic flashing across his face for one unguarded second before he forced his expression back into something calmer than he felt. She asked what the guilt in his words meant, and he told her only that every man carried regrets, deflecting again, and too exhausted to fight it, she let the question go. In a shop nearby, a television played a business news segment naming Olumide as the missing heir at the center of a contested company vote, the volume low beneath market noise. Adunni passed the open shop front and caught only a fragment of the broadcast, a name that meant nothing to her yet, before the segment changed to something else entirely. Walking just behind her, Dapo saw the same broadcast and pulled his cap lower over his eyes, his heart pounding at how close discovery had just come without her noticing. Folarin's men approached Tunji directly this time, offering him a sum large enough to retire on if he would confirm Olumide's location formally before the board. Tunji refused outright, telling them plainly that loyalty bought once stays bought, and that his had never once been on sale, not for any sum they could name. Frustrated, Folarin's men shifted to threats instead, warning that his small pension and decades of service could vanish just as easily as the offer he had turned down. Undeterred, Tunji drove straight to the compound to warn Olumide that Folarin was closing in from every direction now, no longer satisfied with one quiet line of attack. Olumide listened calmly on the surface, recognizing that the careful walls around his test were finally collapsing on a timeline no longer fully his to control. He resolved to move the reveal forward immediately, determined to surface on his own terms before Folarin's men or Beatrice's sharp eyes forced the truth out in a way he could not shape. Overnight, Chief Bankole's condition turned critical, machines and doctors crowding into his hospital room as alarms rose through the quiet corridor outside. Called urgently to the hospital, Tunji stood watching helplessly as the man he had served for 30 years fought simply to keep breathing through the night. Outside the compound, Olumide took the call from Tunji and gripped the wall hard, torn between rushing straight to his father's side and one more quiet night beside Adunni. Sensing something had shaken him deeply, Adunni asked if he was all right, and for the first time he told her something partly true: someone he loved was dying. She held his hand without asking for the rest of the explanation, and for one quiet moment, the lie sitting between them felt almost bearable to carry. Before dawn, Olumide pressed a gentle kiss to her sleeping forehead, dressed quietly in the dark, and walked out the door to finally become himself again. Adunni woke before sunrise to find his mat empty and cold, panic rising fast as she realized that he had left without a single word of explanation. She searched the compound and the streets beyond it, asking Bisi and every neighbor she passed, but no one had seen him leave or knew where he had gone. Landlord Bashiru offered no comfort, suggesting flatly that the useless man had finally done what everyone warned her he would do from the beginning. Mama Adunni, weak on her mat, told her daughter there must be a reason, though even she could not keep the doubt fully out of her voice. Across the city, Olumide arrived at the hospital and found Tunji already at his father's bedside, the old chief barely conscious beneath the machines. Olumide sat close and took his father's hand, and through the haze of medication, the old man's eyes slowly focused and recognized his son at last. Relief broke across the chief's face, and gripping his son with surprising strength, he begged him to stop Folarin before the company slipped away entirely. Olumide promised to fix everything, then stepped into the corridor to call his legal team, finally ready to expose the full extent of Folarin's company takeover scheme. A hospital insider loyal to Folarin reported breathlessly that the heir believed dead had resurfaced at his father's bedside, sending Folarin's careful plans into sudden disarray. Folarin rushed to the hospital himself, confronting Olumide in the corridor with a mask of cousinly relief that could not quite hide the panic underneath. Olumide met him calmly, listing the false death reports and the quiet purchase of a stranger's hospital debt, making plain that he already knew everything Folarin had done. Cornered, Folarin tried to spin the story, insisting he had only acted in the company's best interest, while his cousin vanished without a word to anyone. Olumide announced he would address the full board himself before any vote took place, stripping Folarin's claim of whatever legitimacy it still carried. Back in the slum, Adunni's search grew desperate, leading her even toward the hospital district, hunting for any thread that might explain where her husband had gone. Beatrice, her own investigator's report finally confirming what she suspected, decided to move directly on the company rather than waste more time searching the slum herself. She arrived at Bankole Holdings, demanding to see Olumide personally, invoking old ties at the reception desk as though nothing between them had ever broken. Buried in the board crisis, Olumide refused the meeting outright, unwilling to let anything pull his focus from saving the company and protecting Adunni. Rebuffed, Beatrice threatened to take what she knew of his disappearance and his disguise straight to the press unless he agreed to see her in person. Weighing the danger of a leak against the danger of the meeting itself, Olumide agreed to a brief audience, determined only to control the story before it spread. Separately, Folarin decided his last resort was to discredit Adunni publicly before the truth could surface on its own, doubling down on cruelty in place of strategy. He sent men into the slum to spread word that Dapo was a wanted fraud who had abandoned a pregnant lover elsewhere, aiming to ruin Adunni before anyone learned the real truth. The rumor moved through the market within hours, neighbors who once merely gossiped now turning openly hostile, certain Adunni had been harboring a criminal all along. Already frantic with worry over her missing husband, Adunni now faced public humiliation at the market, women refusing to sell her supplies, accusing her of disgracing the street. Frightened by how quickly the rumor had grown, landlord Bashiru threatened to throw her belongings into the street that very day, eviction order or not. Bisi, nearly alone in her defense, stood between Adunni and the angry crowd, insisting loudly that she had known her too long to believe such ugly lies. Humiliated and frightened, Adunni held tightly to one belief. Whatever Dapo was hiding, he was not the man the rumor described, and she would not abandon that conviction. Hearing the commotion from inside, Mama Adunni dragged herself to the doorway and told the gathered crowd she would rather die than watch them shame her daughter further. The effort proved too much for her weakened body, and Mama Adunni collapsed in the doorway in full view of the entire gathered crowd. Adunni screamed for help and cradled her mother in the dust, while the same neighbors who had condemned her moments before now scrambled to help carry her. Across town, the chief's monitors spiked sharply, doctors rushing in as Olumide, mid-conversation with his lawyers, was pulled urgently back toward his father's room. His phone rang with news from Tunji about Mama Adunni's collapse at the very same moment his father's condition crashed, forcing an impossible choice in a single breath. Torn between two dying figures, who each needed him, Olumide sent Tunji racing to the slum in his own car while he stayed helplessly at his father's side. Tunji reached the community clinic when neighbors had carried Mama Adunni and paid her entire outstanding bill on the spot without offering a single word of explanation. Stunned by the size of the payment from the quiet driver, the clinic staff asked no further questions and admitted her immediately for proper treatment. Exhausted and frightened, Adunni finally turned on Tunji directly, demanding to know where her husband was and what exactly he was not telling her. Watching her break down from worry rather than greed or anger, Tunji decided at last that no lie could be allowed to survive a moment longer. He told her gently but plainly that the man she had married was not Dapo at all, but Olumide Bankole, and that everything since the crash had been a test of her own heart. Adunni stared in silence as the floor of her understanding shifted entirely beneath everything she had believed about the man she had grown to love. She said nothing for a long moment, then asked only one question through her tears. Had any part of what they shared ever been real, or all of it only an experiment? Tunji drove Adunni and her recovering mother back toward the slum, gently urging her not to decide anything about her marriage until she had heard Olumide's side herself. At the hospital, Chief Bankole stabilized just enough to insist, weakly but firmly, that his son go now and face the board while there was still time left to act. Torn over Adunni, but aware the vote could not wait, Olumide resolved to finish what he had started, choosing the boardroom first since the company's fate hung on hours, not days. Olumide walked into Bankole Holdings and the lobby fell into stunned murmurings, employees recognizing for the first time in weeks the heir they had been told was dead. He entered the boardroom mid-session and the assembled board, along with Folarin at its head, froze entirely at the sight of the man standing in the doorway. Folarin tried to recover, claiming relief at his cousin's survival, but his voice cracked as he scrambled to explain the falsified death reports he had filed. Methodically, Olumide laid out the false reports, the secretly purchased hospital debt, the bribe sent to Adunni, and the violent attack ordered against him in a dark alley. All the board members who had quietly backed Folarin began turning visibly against him as the full weight of the evidence settled over the room. Olumide presented documentation Tunji had quietly gathered for months, proof of the falsified searches and the debt purchase laid out in careful, undeniable order. Cornered completely, Folarin lashed out, accusing Olumide of abandoning the company recklessly for a test no sane businessman would ever have risked. Olumide answered evenly that the test had cost him nearly everything that mattered to him and that he would make the very same choice again without hesitation. The board voted unanimously to remove Folarin from any further consideration, referring the falsified reports and the bribery directly to the company's legal counsel. Security escorted Folarin out of the building, while former allies and employees alike watched his exit in a cold, unbroken silence. Outside, news crews already gathered on rumors swarmed Olumide the moment he stepped through the doors, cameras flashing toward the heir the city had believed was gone. A reporter asked directly where he had been all these months, and Olumide finally, with no reason left to hide, told the city the whole story plainly, including Adunni's name. The broadcast went out live across Lagos. Olumide Bankole's months in disguise, his marriage out of pity to a market trader named Adunni, and the true scope of the test he had run. Across the city, the very market women who once mocked Adunni for marrying a useless man watched the same broadcast and fell into stunned, ashamed silence. Landlord Bashiru, listening from his shop radio, nearly dropped his tea, recognizing the very man he had twice threatened to throw out of his own compound. At the clinic, a nurse's phone played the same broadcast aloud, and Adunni, sitting beside her recovering mother, heard her own name spoken across national news. She watched in disbelief as footage rolled of Olumide's old life, the very same face she had nursed back to health in a dusty doorway months before. The neighbors who had mocked or merely pitied her now flooded the clinic hallway outside, suddenly desperate to be seen standing anywhere near her at all. Sickened by the sudden reversal, Adunni realized people now valued her only for a fortune she had never known existed, the very thing the whole test was built to expose. Watching the same broadcast from her apartment, Beatrice recalculated instantly, already plotting how to position herself back into Olumide's life now that the truth had gone public. Finished with the board and the press, Olumide returned to the slum room to find Adunni gone, only Bisi left to tell him she was at the clinic with her mother. He arrived at the clinic and the hallway of suddenly fawning neighbors parted in stunned silence at the sight of the man from the broadcast walking toward her door. Adunni, standing in the doorway, met his eyes for the first time since learning the truth, neither of them finding words enough to begin with. Olumide began to explain, starting with Beatrice's betrayal and the years he had spent believing no one could love him without his name attached to it. Her voice shaking, Adunni asked why he had never simply trusted her with the truth instead of letting her marry a lie out of pity. Olumide admitted there was no good answer, only fear, and that the longer the lie lasted, the more terrified he became of losing what had grown real beneath it. Adunni told him that pity had gotten her into the marriage, but it was never pity that made her refuse every bribe, defend him in that alley, or hold his hand without needing an explanation. What hurt most, she said, was not the wealth he had hidden, but that he let her be tested without ever once telling her a test was even happening. Olumide offered no defense for that, only the truth that her answer to every test, known or unknown, had been exactly the same from the very beginning. She stayed. Beatrice arrived uninvited at the clinic, attempting to insert herself into the reunion, insisting she had always believed in him, even when the world called him dead. Past politeness from exhaustion, Adunni asked her plainly where that belief had been the day she walked out over a rumor of his ruin. Olumide told Beatrice, calmly and without cruelty, that whatever answer she was looking for had left her the day she walked out, and it was not coming back. Exposed in front of the gathered hallway as exactly the kind of woman her own history had always shown her to be, Beatrice left without another word. By the week's end, Folarin faced formal fraud and bribery charges, removed entirely from the Bankole family's company holdings as his ambitions collapsed into public record. Informed of his nephew's downfall and his son's reconciliation from his hospital bed, Chief Bankole allowed himself finally the first real rest he had known in weeks. Still raw, but no longer doubting that something real had survived the lie, Adunni told Olumide she needed time, not an ending, before deciding what came next. Days passed with Adunni staying close to her recovering mother at the clinic, giving the space she asked for, while Olumide visited quietly each evening without ever pressing her for an answer. Tunji, visiting too, gently reminded her that the man who fixed her stall table and stood between her and a rude customer had never once stopped being real, whatever name he carried. Recovering at last with proper treatment, Mama Adunni told her daughter that love tested honestly is rarer and worth more than love that was never tested at all. Alone, Adunni returned one last time to the slum room, lifted the same loose floorboard, and finally let herself read the notebook in full from its very first page. The pages held his complete confession, the fear that followed Beatrice, the guilt over the test, and page after page about small, ordinary days with Adunni he said he never wanted to lose. Moved past her anger, Adunni understood that the man in those pages had loved her before he found the courage to plan telling her any of the truth. She found Olumide waiting outside the clinic that evening, as he had every evening, and told him simply that she was finally ready to talk. She told him plainly that she had never loved a billionaire, only a man who mended tables and carried akara trays, and that man, it turned out, had never been a lie at all. Olumide told her that the test had ended long ago and that the only result that ever mattered had already been decided the day she handed an unopened bribe back to a stranger. He asked her again properly, this time, his real name spoken aloud between them, to remain his wife, not out of pity or duty, but by her own free choice alone. Adunni said yes, this time without hesitation, without duty standing in for the word she now meant with her whole heart. Well enough to travel, Chief Bankole insisted on meeting Adunni and her mother properly, welcoming them into the family without a trace of the snobbery anyone might have expected. Folarin, old allies within the company, quietly distanced themselves, while the board formally confirmed Olumide as chairman with wide restored support across every division. The family announced a renewal of vows, blending the modest community that had sheltered Olumide unknowingly with the corporate world he had been born into all along. Preparations brought market traders, slum neighbors, and company executives together under one roof for the first time, an unlikely guest list assembling without a single complaint. BC was given a place of honor as chief bridesmaid, still teasing her old friend gently about the very husband she had once warned her so firmly against. Landlord Bashiru, invited out of grace rather than obligation, arrived sheepish and overdressed, finally addressing Adunni by her full marital title with genuine hard-earned respect. On the morning of the ceremony, Adunni wore her late father's cowrie shell bracelet beside new coral beads gifted by Chief Bankole, blending both halves of her story into one. Olumide, dressed for the first time in public exactly who he truly was, waited at the altar, without disguise, without testing, without anything left in him to hide. Healthy enough to stand unaided for the first time in months, Mama Adunni walked her daughter partway down the aisle herself, refusing every offer for support. They exchanged vows again, this time fully known to one another, kola knot broken between two families who were at last both completely present. The market women who had once mocked her watched from the crowd, no longer resented but genuinely welcomed, since Adunni had insisted every neighbor from that old street receive an invitation. As the celebration carried into the evening, the elders among the guests repeated the same old saying to anyone who would listen. Love that depends on money does not last, but love tested by its absence usually does. Under lights blending two worlds completely, Adunni and Olumide watched their unlikely beginnings settle, at last, into an ordinary, unremarkable happiness that neither of them would ever again take for granted.